Happy Pride, readers and book enthusiasts. Welcome to Pride Book Fest. My name is Kalisha Cole. My pronouns are she/her, and I run a Bookstagram account under the name of Callie's Bookish Rambles, where I review all kinds of YA lit with aesthetic photos. I am very excited to bring you the Queer Adventure panel. We'll talk about the genre of adventure, fantastical creatures, and how LGBTQ is included within the genre. Now, I'd love to introduce our panelists. So if everyone could say their name, their pronouns, and the books that they have written.
I think I am first in alphabetical order, if I do, in fact, know my alphabet.
You beat me out, yeah.
Great. My name is MK England. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the author of 2 so far queer adventure books. The first one is The Disasters, purple space book, basically be gay, do crimes in space. And then the other one is Spell Hacker. And that one is kind of a sci-fi fantasy mashup. It is a high-tech futuristic world, but with a heist crew who steals magic. So those are my 2 existing books. I have an upcoming YA rom-com, The One True Me and You, that is, a female non-binary romance, and it's delightful and fun, and I hope you check it out. That's me.
I'm Amy Ewing. I'm the author of the Lone City trilogy, which includes the Jewel, the White Rose, and the Black Key, and also the Cerulean. I have available the Cerulean duology, which is the Cerulean and the Alcazar, and both are sort of feminist-driven fantasy stories.
Hi, I'm CD Lee. I'm the author of the Sidekick Squad series, which is about a group of queer teens that take on a corrupt government superhero agency in a post-dystopian world. I also have upcoming A Clash of Steel, which comes out this September, which is a queer Treasure Island retelling set in the South China Sea.
Hi, I'm FT Lukens. I use they, she, and I am the author of 6 books, but my most recent is In Deeper Waters, which is a high fantasy, piratey, high seas adventure romance.
Hey, I'm Maggie Takuta Hall. My pronouns are she, her. I'm also the author of a piratey queer romance called The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea. And I have a graphic novel coming out this fall called Squad, which is about teenage girls who turn into werewolves at the full moon and eat sex pests at parties.
Thank you all for your introductions. That's very great. I've read one of each of your novels, so I get a sense of everything, and it's really beautiful. I'd love to open up going more in depth about your books. Each of you brings something unique to the adventure sci-fi/fantasy genre, from a treasure island retelling to space quests and everything in between. I'd love to ask what inspired each of your stories. Do you have any particular adventures that you remember as a young child that influenced what you wrote? If you wouldn't mind sharing the genesis of your ideas, and then pitch your book to complete the picture for our readers.
I can go first.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go for it.
The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea was written for one kid in particular. Her name is Claire. She just graduated from Smith College, so you can get the sense of how long it took me to write that book. I started it when she was 12. But I was a bookseller, and she was this like huge, voracious reader. And she loved fantasy books with like rules and murder and kissing and like all the good stuff. And at the time when she was 12, there just weren't a lot of queer fantasy stories that centered female romances or any kind of like gender queerness. And so I wrote it very much for her, with the idea that like I could provide her with a sort of story that she was clearly sort of hungering for. And so now when I try to pitch it to other people, I'm like, it's got mermaids and pirates and a witch and a sentient sea, just like everything that's promised on the tin. And if you want it to be like extra queer, I gotcha.
I guess like mine is like the idea for this ruling came from a panel I was on at the Teen Author Fest that David Levithan runs, or used to run way back when we did things like that. And we had to like write a short story that was like YA explains it all. And he had a list of questions like, like who let the dogs out or like why the chicken crossed the road, and we had to like answer the question. So I picked why is the sky blue? And like everyone else on the panel wrote these like really fun, quirky contemporary things. And I created a city in space populated by a race of magical women with blue blood who like once a year had to sacrifice a bunch of their children by like pushing them off the edge of the city to like color the sky blue with their blood. And then I was thinking, oh shit, as I'm reading it, like, God, I sound like a psycho. And after it was over, like the audience is very quiet, and I was like, oh. And then people came up to me, they were like, hey, I'd really like to read that book. And I was like, oh, maybe that could be a book. So like step one, don't kill your protagonist. So then I sort of, the idea for the civilian sort of came out of how I can adjust that concept to suit that. And I guess I would describe it as like, again, a city in space populated by a race of magical women who are all gay and polyamorous. So a family unit is 3 mothers and 1 daughter, and they're tethered to a planet. And in order to break the tether and move to a new planet, they have to sacrifice one of their own. So a girl is chosen, but it goes wrong. And instead of dying, of course, she falls onto the planet, and she's kidnapped by 2 twins whose father runs a series of religious propaganda theaters in like a Victorian era New York kind of city. So she gets put into one of these shows and has to sort of figure out how to escape.
MK, what about you?
Sure. So The Disasters is fairly boring in its origin in that I am just a giant nerd for space opera and Star Wars and like any sci-fi TV show ever. And so that, but make it gay, was pretty much my inspiration. So I guess the more interesting one would be Spell Hacker. I am a big tabletop role player, and something at one of our D&D or Pathfinder sessions, I can't even remember what it was at this point, something made me think magic hackers. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? Magic hackers, like they're hacking magic? Or does that mean they're like hacking into something to get magic? And I just couldn't let go of that weird little idea. So I went down that rabbit hole and created that sort of high-tech world of hacking, but wherein the magic was something like a physical thing that could be stolen. And so I just kind of went off on that. And of course it ended up being queer because all of my books are. So yeah, that's pretty much that one. Both of them are just deep origins in my nerdy hobbies, whether that would be, binge watching sci-fi on the couch or rolling dice at the gaming table with my buddies.
I love that. CB, what about you?
Sure. I've always loved superheroes, and it's such a huge, like, larger than life medium for storytelling. And there's been so many stories that were like, oh, it's a metaphor for like queerness, or it's a metaphor for this. And like, I'm like, what if it was not a metaphor and the superheroes were actually queer? So the Sidekick Squad came out of like a desire to just have fun with the tropes, have fun with this like futuristic world, and just send these kids off on an adventure and let them, fully dismantle a corrupt society and start a resistance movement. And that was kind of the origin story of like where the like superpowers and dealing with these themes and getting to have like a squad come out of that. And for Treasure Island, it really, like, the theme of adventure is, I love this panel because, everyone's books are so filled with, like, this idea of, like, this story that, and it was the kind of stories that I've always read when I was a kid, and I loved the ideas of going on adventures. And books were, like, my friends and the avenues to go into these far off places and magical lands and go on these grand adventures to save the world. And yet, as a kid, I was like, I don't really see a lot of myself in these stories. So I really internalized like, oh, like queer kids like me don't really get to have these adventures. And so writing the books, writing Treasure Island meant a lot to me, to where I was like, I'm just gonna have a grand old time, have an adventure, send these kids off to save the world.
And FT?
So in Deeper Waters is a fairy tale. It's a fantasy. And I had written already a sci-fi trilogy, and I was in the process of wrapping that up. And then had written a contemporary fantasy duology, and I hadn't yet ventured into fantasy. and I really wanted to. And it kind of evolved from my desire to write a fantasy and try out that new genre, but also I wanted to write a fairy tale. I wanted to write a happy ever after for these characters. And then a lot of, it takes place on the sea, and a lot of that just comes from my experience of growing up on the water and, going out and living on a boat for months at a time and that kind of stuff when I was a teenager. So I used a lot of that in the story to kind of create the adventure of being out on the sea. But it really, it started as these two scenes that I had in my head that I didn't know what to do with. And I really wanted to use them in something, but I was writing another book and I was getting stuck in that other book. And so for National Novel Writing Month 2017 in Nano, I was like, well, I have these two scenes. I'm just going to put them on paper and then just whatever happens, happens. And that's how it started. It went through a lot of edits. It didn't quite work out as, Nano and it's done. That didn't happen. But it was where it started. And when I would get stuck on the other book, I would come over to this book and write on it. And it took about 2 years. I didn't finish it until 2019. So I started in 2017. I didn't finish it until 2019. But really, it just came out of a desire to write a high fantasy, a fairy tale, a happy ever after for these characters. And then just have a lot of magic and mayhem and, the sea and all that kind of thrown in.
Thank you all for your responses. I would love to shift over to world building, specifically the adventure elements. Many of your stories and stories within this genre feature pirates, mermaids, magic, and quests to new worlds / planets or places. Which of these elements can be found in your work, and what was the process like of deciding what to include? And Amy, I would love if you could open up for us.
Definitely quests to other places, and I think other planet. I guess one planet and weirdo city. And I think I love doing that because I love travel, and travel really changes you. And I think when you have to see how other people live, it was such a crazy experience. I lived in Paris when I was in college for a semester, and I was like, oh my god, is this are there just really people existing all around? You kind of don't get it until you really live in it. And I think it helped with my characters to be the agent of change for all of them, really, wherever they wanted to go, even for Sarah, who does not wish to go to this planet, at least initially, sort of getting to know other cultures and the way other people live. And not all of them are good. The Victorian New York is incredibly conservative and male dominated and awful. But having a place to go and having, learning about different places just adds, I think, it adds a nice tension, because I just think character is so important to adventure stories. That's something, to all stories really, but I feel if you're writing a fantasy, you need an access point really badly. You need to be able to connect with something, because you're not going to be connecting to the world, because ideally it's a world you've never ever experienced.
I can go. In the disasters, I think the disasters is the one that's the most sort of stereotypically adventure-y. And I just loved so much that feeling of blasting off into space and going to different planets, even though in this case it wasn't necessarily the most intentional on their part. They end up kind of getting swallowed up in this big crime that they all get scapegoated for, and that kicks off their adventure out into deep space. But I love that process of imagining, okay, what would it look like if we had settled on different planets, and if there were different, groups from all over the world who colonized different planets, what would those planets look like, and what would the experience of being there be like? It's one of the things that's always fascinated me the most about science fiction in general, is just that idea of traveling between worlds and what it would be like to be in a spaceship hanging in the middle of the vast blackness of space.
Oh my god, no.
I'm sorry. Warning for people for whom that is a giant phobia. I'm sorry. It can either be
good for adventure,
endless
though.
existential dread, or it can be a great adventure.
FT, what about you?
I like stories that have like a journey and a quest to go on. And in Deeper Waters, the main character, and I think character, like Amy says, is really important. The character doesn't want to go, and in the first scene, he's throwing up over the side of the ship because he just doesn't want to be there. But it's something that his family is having him do. So he's going out and experiencing new worlds and experiencing new people and events. And I wanted to, draw on a lot of different things that, as a teen, as a young adult, that when you're going out into the world, that you're going to experience new things if you go travel or if you go, outside of your comfort zone. And that's really what I wanted to portray in this story is learning and growing and going outside of your comfort zone and learning new things, and that how that can reflect on yourself and how you can learn new things about yourself along that journey. So that's what I really try to do with In Deeper Waters and the main character. And he goes on a really character arc of growth, really, where he starts off very timid and, like I said, throwing up over the side, and then by the end he's wielding magic and is really comes into his own. So that's what I really like about our adventure stories and the different elements that you can pull in. So yeah.
Thank you. CB?
Sure. I love what you said about the adventure being a vehicle for really a sense of discovery and a sense of self for the character. Because, the world, the setting, the X factor, whether it's in space or on a pirate ship or, in a mysterious city, all of these are details that are cool, right? But in order for us to care about them, like, why do we care? It's about the journey. And yes, it's really fun to come up with these like, oh, what ifs? And that's a beautiful thing that I love that's been discussed so far. Of like, part of the amazing thing about being a writer is getting to ponder, like, what if this world, but a little different? What if this story, but queer? And what changes then is it becomes such a completely original and unique story, and it becomes a totally different adventure. With my Treasure Island retelling, just even changing the main character to a queer girl, to two queer girls, and having that be the sense of place where it started, and setting it, where the adventure now takes place on a journey of like, now we're in this place where society has given you certain expectations, and how do you define that? How do you define your own sense of self when the world is telling you, no, this is who you are? And the adventure really, I think, is part of going on a journey. So there's that physical journey, whether you're off to like, fulfill a prophecy, or you're off to do a heist, or whatever it is you're doing, that physical journey reflects like, that internal journey, which is fun. And I love about all of your work is that like, we get to go along on this, we get to know these people and get to see them become like their best self.
Very well said. I really agree with that. It's like watching all of your characters go through these journeys. It was like I was so immersed in it that I could picture everything. And I think that's really amazing when it comes to adventure stories. Maggie, what would you like to add anything?
Yeah. I did so much research for the world building in The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea. Because it's a whole different world, like we've talked about, but it's so much a confrontation with sort of the privilege that comes with coming from an imperialistic country. And so I wrote a lot of it while I was traveling through South America for like a year and a half. And so a lot of the locations, little details about the landscapes are stolen from them. I stole pretty generously from history and from museum text panels and things like that. But the mermaids were kind of my favorite part of the world building. So in my world, the mermaids are not pretty or like sexy. They're these disgusting little animals that people drink for their blood that gives them like these huge hallucinations. But in return for those hallucinations, they lose part of their memory. And the mermaids themselves are the physical embodiment of the sea's memories. So the sea is too vast and has lived for too long to hold all of her memories herself. And so every time there's something that happens where she feels like, I have to remember this, a mermaid is born and she holds that memory for the sea. And so when people have these visions, what they're seeing is just the sea's memories. And when they kill the mermaids, they steal that from the sea. Like, she loses that memory forever. She has no idea what that is anymore. And it makes her very angry, as it would. And so I got that idea, and this is going to sound like a hard left turn, but I promise it like comes back. My mom's hobby is pulling invasive non-native plants from California state parks, because California is naturally a fire climate. So they're plants that are from here, know how to burn correctly. They're meant to. So, every year they would burn a little bit, and like indigenous people from California knew how to kind of like tend that landscape. But of course, then Americans came in and we were like, fuck that. Sorry, I should have asked if I can cuss.
I know, I already did. I was like, oh, God.
Okay, screw that.
We got a couple in there.
Oh, yes, you got a yes there. Thanks.
So fuck that. And we didn't listen at all. And now we have this sort of like cataclysm issue in California with wildfires. And so this idea of people tampering with something that is natural, with this sort of like proprietary memory of nature, making the whole world more volatile and less safe for all of us, was really interesting to me. And so that's where the mermaids in my book come from. They're meant to sort of embody and give personality to what happens when we tamper sort of blindly with nature for like kicks. Like, we just do this for fun. We love getting wasted, so we're just gonna destroy this. And so that was probably the most fun I had world building, and it was very stressful and hard.
I can imagine.
I feel like our moms would get along. My mom is like huge into like the environment and plants. Like,
It's a good place to start.
I know.
A mom meetup.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for your responses. Moving on to the next question. Many adventure books have historically followed the structure of the hero's journey, first identified by professor and author Joseph Campbell. Those components include a hero, a quest, a journey to unknown territory that creates conflict, a villain, trials that test the character, and finally, a character transformation. What elements of this structure do your stories contain? And did you actively think about these elements as you planned out your books? And I'd like to open this up with CB.
Sure. I think the hero's journey is a very familiar story structure that, is very common. It has rises and falls. I tend to think of a lot more of, because it is a very specific story structure that people are familiar with. And in terms of what I wanted from my stories was to give people that sense of the unknown, but also a sense of like, because it does do away with a lot of like, okay, everything you've known from the past is bad too, and it has a very specific, very Western point of view about like, you have to go to a new place and conquer new things in order to become a new person. And so adventure, I hope that isn't just that. It is about discovery, but it's also about reconciling like the past and the present, and also reconciling like different aspects of yourself, whether it is like, oh, this is a part of my past that I cannot let go of, or should not, or I want to honor it in a specific way. But in terms of hero's journey, I would say that for my stories, there are heroes and there are also people that reject the title of hero, because they're finding that being given that title, being given that responsibility is a form of like doing what people expect you to do. And when you're defining it for yourself and you're like, no, I'm not going to do what you want, or like people expect you to follow a certain path, and then you choose, there's power in choosing to do your own. And I think that in itself is also a very like queer journey itself too, and defining like, oh, I don't want to be the chosen one, and that's, or like, I'll do it, but I'll do it in my own way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's see, Amy, would you like to answer?
Sure. What I like about writing this ruling was that I had four main characters. So it was really fun to have them all sort of have like, and they all have different elements of that, but they all like, I have like multiple villains, which was really fun. I don't really like big bads. I find them to be very boring. I always find like Tom Riddle to be more interesting than Voldemort or whatever. It's always the example I kind of use. Like I like when someone's just like, I want to like take over the world and like crush everything. Like Sauron's kind of, you're like, yeah, you're really scary, but you're kind of lame. And I liked being able to have, each of my characters are all actually working sort of in tandem with each other. Eventually, I guess at first they're not, and fighting, and finding how there can be a villain can be something different to one person versus another. Like one of the villains is a dad, and one of them is like the high priestess that rules over the cerulean city. And that also is really fun because I think there are different levels of people that get in our way in different, in varying stages of danger, I suppose. But having that to come up against, and I think having multiple ones, especially when you have multiple heroes, because they all have to have their own arcs, but then their arcs have to like come together, it's so it's nice to like spread out sort of, to not have it be like so focused as like they just go, it's like this and this and this and that's it. It has to be sort of like more like a spider web than like a direct line.
Yeah. FT, what about you?
So I'm very familiar with the hero's journey. One of my degrees is in classics, so we really studied that a lot. I wrote a book, The Rules and Regulations for Mediating Myths and Magic, which relies heavily on the hero's journey. It's there are different cryptids and myths that interact with the main character, and one of those is a hero, and he has to complete the hero cycle throughout the novel. And so in that instance, yes, I really relied on the hero's journey for that one specific character to be able to, complete the call to adventure, to have their metaphorical or literal death, get their boon, come back. I mean, all of that. But when it comes to like drafting a story or working on a character arc, I think there's some parts of the hero's journey that, I feel like I use a lot, like the call to adventure, especially an adventure story. And then, the build up, and then maybe the failure, and then rising from the failure and moving on. But not every piece always fits. And so I pick and choose which pieces of it I use. And if it's relevant to what the character needs or what the plot needs, but it's not something for In Deeper Waters that I really like stuck to. For rules and regs, yes. I used it extensively and actually had it pulled up on my computer and made sure that one character, Leo, went through each part of it. But for, other stories, adventure stories, I do like the kind of call to adventure, but beyond that, it really just kind of, what do I want to accomplish with the story? What does the plot need? And what do I want the character to do and go through? In Deeper Waters for Tal, he does, like I said, have the call to adventure where he's on his brother's boat, and then has the character arc, and then suffers a really big failure. About halfway through, maybe a little more halfway through, he suffers a really big failure. And the story really is about him coming back from that failure and growing, and then picking himself back up and continuing on his journey. So that's how I've used it in that story.
Thank you. Maggie?
Yeah, I guess I would love to talk about villains because it's one of my favorite things to think about, in that in both The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea and the book that I have coming out this fall, Squad, there are no heroes, and arguably everyone is in some way a villain. In The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea, basically everybody who's in this story is somehow complicit or directly causing someone else's pain. And that was something I thought about a lot. And I do understand when some people are like, I don't like any of the characters. And it's like, yeah, okay. I'm sorry. You probably own an iPhone, so you're complicit too. But sure, that's fine. And because I was thinking so much about sort of like globalism and the way that our economies hurt people that we don't see, and, et cetera, et cetera. And in Squad, they're girls who murder boys. Like, that's what they do. And they have zero remorse about it. And I don't know, if you're a person who doesn't like the death penalty, like, that's a little morally gray, even if they're bad people that they are mostly eating. And to me, for all the work I do for young adults, the thing that I try to keep in mind, or my biggest goal, is that even if everyone in the story is in some way a villain, even if you like them, the thing that sort of saves them is queer love. Like, it's always queer love is going to be their salvation. It's the reason for their survival. And so even if you're not a werewolf or a mermaid, I hope that, you know, when you read my work, you in some way see some path to happiness that is paved by queer love.
I love that. MK, what about you?
I love that too. So definitely if any of my books fall into the hero's journey, it's completely by accident. I am aware of it. I have read about it. I have never used it as a storytelling tool, intentionally at least, though I'm sure I've absorbed plenty of story throughout my life that has been based on that, like Star Wars, my grand lifelong obsession. But I would say the thing that I am probably obsessed with, kind of under those that umbrella of different elements of the hero's journey, is that journey to unfamiliar territory, which in the disasters definitely happens. They get thrown out into space, out into all of the, you know, worlds that have been settled by Earth. But in a lot of my other work, I really seem to avoid that. And especially in Spell Hacker, the story is really much more about home and about the things that the main character has been clinging to and doesn't want to leave. It's almost a kind of a flip-flop of that, rather than being flung out into the unknown and experiencing conflict that way. A lot of the conflict is coming from her total inability to let go of her home. And, you know, ultimately, I feel like a lot of my books come down to, you know, home is people, not places. And so it's only by kind of going through that journey and coming to understand that and accept that relationship with her friends, her found family, that she is finally able to leave, you know, the place that she's been clinging to and go on to some unfamiliar territory in the future. So that's my random meandering thoughts of the hero's journey that I have not studied at all in any way. Sorry.
Thank you. On the topic of queer love and love in general and just identity, I'd like to shift over to queer identities and adventure stories. Until very recently, queer characters barely existed in sci-fi/fantasy stories, except in subtext. Queer readers and viewers often had to latch onto transforming mermaids or the idiosyncrasies of characters like Captain Jack Sparrow or C-3PO to find queerness. Your books turn the tides, so I'd like to know, what was the decision like for you to write queer stories and characters within the genre? Why these stories and why at this time?
I'll go first, because I think mine is like I don't think about things before I do them ever. So there was no intention, like, really whatsoever, to be like, oh, I'm gonna like write, this is gonna be what this is. Like, I never really know what I'm writing until I'm like 100 pages in. I'm like, oh, I think this is what I'm writing about. But I think, but for me, what was the most important thing for me writing the Cerulean and writing specifically The City Above the Sky, which is where the Cerulean live, was about family and about how families don't have to look like one thing. And especially how non-biological parents are just as much parents. I mean, Sarah has 3 mothers and they're all her mothers. Not just the mother that gave birth to her, but, you know, and they all have different roles in the family and they're all important and she loves them all. And I think that is something, as someone who's like not going to have biological kids probably, and someone who's friends with people who have adopted and done the foster care system, and it's like so important. Like, you know what I mean? That to me was like showing that like family does not have to be one thing and love does not have to look one way.
Totally.
But I didn't realize it until after. I was like, oh, that's what these 3 moms are about. Oh, okay. It just came like as the world building first, and then it was like, oh, that's what you're exploring. You know, that's thematically what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. First of all, not enough people mention C-3PO in the canon of queer characters, so thank you. Mm-hmm. Love that. So for me, I mean, I kind of mentioned that I had written this book like specifically for a queer kid and kind of giving her the story that she wanted. But I think one of the reasons that having queer characters in sort of like big adventure stakes, you know, life or death kind of stories is so healing and important is that often learning to love yourself as a queer person or see yourself as a queer person or finding your kind of like queer found family is a question of survival. It is the thing that makes us feel safe and, you know, like we have a place in the world. And I don't know, even if nobody's trying to murder you, it can be like so frightening to feel like you're alone with that. And so I love adventure stories as sort of a catharsis for that fear that you might feel that, like, you know, if telling your family is going to be terrifying, or if your friends knowing is going to be hard, or the way that you're treated at work is hard because of it, or at school, reading a story that in some way sort of makes you feel like you're not alone with those feelings is so helpful and also so comforting. At least for me, I have found that, like, that's why I love queerness and adventure stories particularly, is that it kind of embodies what the stakes feel like, even if that's not actually what the stakes are in your life.
I love that. I totally agree about like the power of feeling seen is so, it is like the first time it happens to you, it's that comfort, it's that balm, it's that of feeling like I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that feels this way. And it is one of those things about adventure stories where it's just like, wow, this could happen to me. And it's the magic of books, it's the magic of media that can inspire you to be like, wow, I too could have the confidence to like do what I think is right, to fight for my beliefs, to stand up for what I believe in, to you know, to really look forward and try to, you know, as I mentioned, be your best self. But a lot of this is, you know, the stories that we grew up with, that I grew up with as a kid. All of these ventures were very specific to that did make me feel alone. Like, okay, these adventures are only for like straight white boys, or like this is the kind of person that gets chosen to be the chosen one. And so I wanted kids to feel like they could be a hero, that they could be the center of the narrative, because you really, like, I think as a queer person, you're taught not to take up space. You're taught to be like, to be accommodating, to be satisfied with crumbs. And I want people to feel comfortable enough to be like, bake their own cakes. You'd be like, I want this, and this is what I'm going to go out and get. And that's really where like identity and the themes come from in our book, because these people, these identities, they exist in real life, and I want them to exist in our fantasies too, because the fantasy, the speculativeness is where we, you know, we get that validation, and seeing someone, whether it's like wielding a sword or fighting with magic, it's just, and it's fun, you know, like we want to have fun with our media, and that joy, that like bringing an aspect to the story that isn't just about your pain. Like you're not just here to be someone's lesson on how to be an empathetic person. You're here because your journey is important and valid.
Well said. MK?
Yeah, for me, I don't think there was ever really a decision point of I'm gonna include queer characters now. It was baked into my like mission as an author from day one, and also just what I deeply wanted so badly from literature was queer characters. You know, when I was a kid and a teen and a now, I've never really been one for contemporary very much, more now than when I was younger. But when I was younger, I did not want any book that smelled of reality in any way. I did not want serious issues. I didn't want, I was even very uncomfortable with, you know, a lot, anytime they tried to put like romance in my Star Wars books or anything, I was like, please no, you're making it worse for me. And it took me, of course, a while to figure out, like, oh, it's because it's not the romance that I want to be there. And so you're making me feel like even more excluded from this thing that I love than I already do. So, you know, a lot of my writing is kind of born of that love of stuff like Star Wars, where I wanted so desperately to just be there and be part of that world. And I just felt like the spot was not the right shape for me. So I wanted to create those kinds of universes and write books for the kind of reader that I was, that just wanted spaceships and explosions and stuff, but also a lot of like queer characters having a great time.
Oh yeah, and you succeeded. They're all out there now, and everyone's loving them. FT, what about you?
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna piggyback off of what MK said. It's that, you know, as a kid growing up, I just loved fantasy and adventure and sci-fi stories and grew up with Star Wars. And the first book I ever truly loved was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I just really loved those worlds. And when I wanted to create my own worlds, I wanted to create a spot where I fit in them. And it's been a long journey for me about identity and queerness. And, you know, now that I've gotten to where I feel like I'm myself, and I want to continue to write stories that have happy endings for us, and with adventure along the way, and like, you know, explosions and pirates and mermaids, and have those stories out there in the world for, you know, another young reader or someone else who's, you know, struggling with themselves or their identity or where they fit in the world, and having a book that they may pick up that maybe I wrote or CB wrote or someone else here wrote, and have them see themselves in it is, you know, the joy of being an author.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I add on one thing before we move on?
Oh yeah,
which is just that I think a lot about the way that sort of like strict realism is often used by like straight cis white men to kind of knock down queer and people of color artists who like they just don't really want to hear our opinion on things. Like it's one of the ways that our work and our ideas are discounted. And I think that is particularly pernicious because you can't change a world. Like if you can only imagine what is and you can't imagine what could be, you're sort of limiting what any kind of change there could possibly be. So obviously people in power enjoy sort of staying where they are safely ensconced in their power and their privilege, whereas everyone else maybe would like an outlet and like would like a place where that's not true. And I hate the idea of subjecting children only to realism and being like, that's it. That's the world. Nothing will ever change. Like what a horrible thing to tell children and to tell young adults. And so I think it's extra important that fantasy and science fiction writers give us queerness with explosions and mermaids and like all that kind of good stuff. One, to get kids who feel like they don't fit a place where they feel like they belong, but also to give all kids just like the imaginative ability to see a world outside of what they know. Like most kids probably don't have three mothers that are taking care of them. But if they can imagine a future where they're taken care of by like a polyamorous trio of matriarchs, imagine what else they can do. Like what other kind of lives they can give the rest of us.
And be kinder people, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And they see someone else be doing something that they might think, because obviously kids need to like want to fit in, right? But at the same time, now it's like, look how you can fit in so many different ways. And, you know, what seems weird can be actually really cool if you know, give it a chance.
Yeah. And the argument of like, I love that, because like the argument of like, oh, this is realistic, is that it's not actually, it's erasure, because it's not actually what people are describing as realism is actually, that is the fantasy, that your city is all white, that you're showing me in New York that doesn't have any people of color. Like that's an invention that doesn't exist in the real world. And you're saying that everyone is straight, that is completely fictional, because there's you don't know anyone's gender identity, you don't know you don't know how in the past, like in history, where people are like, oh, well, this was the 1800s, like no one used these words. And like, people may not have used the words like gay or queer or like used to identify themselves that way, but people, like, we have always existed, and we have existed in the past, and we exist in the present. And the power to imagine ourselves in a future, whether that be like on a spaceship or in a fantasy world, like that gives us the ability, like you said, Maggie, to imagine what could be. And like that's so much better than the strict the strict binary of just like, well, this is the way it always has been. And that just feels so bleak to me, to just settle being like, well, that's just it. And I love that, like in fiction is really like that. I think that's the first place where I learned to like really question reality and just be like, well, what if things were like this?
I love the idea that the notion of sort of like a cis heteronormative world is the fantasy. And I hope you don't mind that I'll absolutely be using that going forward constantly. Like, what kind of fantasy are we talking? Are we talking mermaids, or are we talking cis heteronormative fantasy? We can put Philip Roth in the category of cis heteronormative fantasy, and everything else seems great.
I love that. So on the topic of limitations within the fantasy genre and the representation of queer characters and such, when it comes to adventure stories, what is something that you would like to see more of in YA literature, especially when it comes to LGBTQ representation? What can be improved upon or fixed at the publishing level? And whoever wants to start off can go right ahead.
I can start because my answer is very short. My answer is support. These books exist. They're out there. We all have written them. They just need more support at the publishing level. Dahlia Adler, if you're out there, your ears are burning. Dahlia,
she's the best.
Dahlia loves to shout anytime somebody says, there needs to be more, FF romance, and we just need more FF fantasy and things like that. And Dahlia's like, it's there. It's just because of all of the things we have been talking about. It doesn't get the attention, the promotion. It's for so many reasons. There's so much of it out there that's so great, and it's just not getting into the hands of readers. It's not getting into their eyeballs in the form of advertisements, all of that kind of stuff. So anyway, support. Yay, support.
Support all day, every day.
I feel like one of the main aspects that I hope to see more of is more editors, more people who work in the publishing industry, more people being able to support a career within the publishing industry, because it's incredibly challenging especially with there's so many, like, these are the people who say yes, right? And so there are so many amazing writers, and by all means, if you're a writer, write your story. We need that. We want that out there, and definitely encourage you. But if you're like, oh, well, I just love doing aesthetics, what can I do? I'm like, well, you could be a publicity manager, you could be a marketing director. There's so many amazing careers within the publishing industry that people don't think about. And having people from marginalized communities be in those positions, hiring people in those positions, and this is like a systemic thing of like, what can change, what needs to change, is that historically this industry has been very white, very predominantly from higher income people, because these are the people who can afford to like live on a like 25K salary in New York City. And yet with the advent of like remote work, and like people are learning like you don't need to live in New York City at this like very minimal salary, or like even like the idea of like unpaid internships, like, well, like who can afford to do an unpaid internship? So, supporting organizations that have the ability to offer careers and training and meaningful training and support for people of color, for marginalized folks, for queer people to enter in these positions and really be, all along the way in all sorts of media, like not just publishing. I mean, like if you want to be a director, if you want to be a camera person, if you want to be a cinematographer, like at every step of the way, people who are making media, I think you should look into like supporting people in all these avenues.
Maggie, go right ahead. Sorry.
No, Amy, you go for it. I was just trying to fill the quiet.
Thinking about what you were saying, how like we're even still like we've come so far. You feel like sometimes you're like, oh yeah, like we've come so far, and then you're like, no, we haven't. When it's like this is the first, like I'm thinking of like the Oscars when they're like, this is the first win for like an Asian woman as director, and like only like 3 of 3 women. You know what I mean? You're just like, oh my god, it's not there. Like and it needs to be everywhere. I think you're right. Like behind the scenes as an author in publishing everywhere. You know what I mean? Like that's how it becomes just like, yeah, this is a thing and we're going to support it. I really do think that MK, you're right. It's just like support.
Yeah, I'm with MK and CB. I'm with all of you. I agree. But I especially think that CB's answers and MK's dovetail really beautifully together, which is that if you had more people of color and queer people who were editors, publicists, marketing people, publishers themselves, it would be easier and it would be more of a meritocracy for support. Because I think what ends up happening is like a bunch of cis white ladies sit down together in a room and they're like, well, like I love this book. And I don't mean to malign the entire industry, but I think what can often happen is like they'll sit down together and go, I love this book, but we're already highlighting this book from a Black queer author. So like maybe we don't want to spend our entire marketing budget with this one if this other one is already getting our money. And I feel like that would be less of a conversation if there were more diverse people in publishing. And I think too, even when there are diverse people in publishing, the one thing I would love to see is more of an acknowledgement of intersectionality. So it's true that you might be queer, but you might also be white, which means that you live with a certain privilege that, like, you know, your queer people of color don't get to live with. And I think that that is a problem that I see across writers, across readers, across people who work in publishing at every step of the way. There's kind of, I feel like there could be a lot more acknowledgement of privilege rather than sort of like shopping for your marginalizations, being clear about the systems that have helped you be successful that are not fair and working to dismantle those. And I think, you know, sometimes that comes down to sexuality, sometimes that comes down to racial identity. It kind of doesn't matter whatever marginalization that you are particularly, you have when you have sort of like other privileges as well that you don't acknowledge.
Mm-hmm. FT, what about you?
I think it's just going to be an echo of what everybody else has said. I mean, it really is, you know, support for books that are there, support for writers that are here, support for writers that are upcoming, that are coming up. And then also just more diversity throughout all the levels of publishing. And that is just going to lift everybody up. And it's going to get more eyes on books that are needed out in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as a bookstagram, it's kind of the same thing. You know, we tried to promote like diverse literature, you know, and I feel like a lot more bookstagrammers should do that. You know, and it all works the same, you know, publishing and bookstagramming and authors and promotions, you know, getting those voices out there that you don't see often. You know, it would be really nice if more people could do that, you know, get those underrated novels on the screen, because a lot of the time bookstagram shows the same thing. So all right, so we're reaching almost the 60-minute mark. So to end off with the final question, what can we expect next from you all as you continue your own adventures? Is there anything you have in the works now that you can tease for our readers? And this, whoever wants to start us off.
I guess I'll go. I have kind of a lot on my plate right now. I have something coming out later this year that is still unannounced, so I still can't talk about it despite the fact that it will be on shelves in like 3 or 4 months. So it's a really cool thing, though. It's very like, you know, dreams come true kind of opportunity. So I'm excited for that. I have my first YA contemporary rom-com coming out March 1st, 2022 from Wednesday Books. That's The One True Me and You. It's a weekend whirlwind romance between a fanfic author and a teen beauty pageant contestant when a hotel plays host to both of those things in the same weekend. And then I have a middle grade trilogy of 12 and 13-year-old video game nerds that I'm just very excited about. That'll be out in 2022 and 2023. And more rumblings in the works, so stay tuned.
That's great. CB, you want to talk about your Treasure Island retelling coming out soon?
Sure. Yeah, that will be out September the 7th. It's actually up for request on NetYallian at OI. So if any Bookstagrammers or book blogging folks want to check it out and request it, it is up there. And I suppose at the time of this panel being aired, it will still be up there. So please do enjoy. I hope everyone has a chance to enjoy it. Also coming up, we're Interlude Press and Duet Books are releasing a fifth anniversary edition of Not Your Sidekick, which I can't believe has been out for 5 years, but it has. So there's going to be a ton of cool new content, some sneak looks at some of the super secret files of Jessica Tran, which she did during her time. There's a lot of fun little extras from the Sidekick Squad universe. And yeah, that's what's coming up for me. I have some other projects that haven't been announced, but in general, lots more queer things, lots more fun things. And yeah, stay tuned. I can't wait to share them all with you.
That's awesome. FT, you have anything coming up soon?
Well, In Deeper Waters just came out less than a month ago. And so that's out in the world now. Very exciting. And then I have a book that's coming out spring of next year called So This Is Ever After. I've seen the cover. It's not revealed yet, but it's amazing. And it is another fantasy. And we kind of pitch it as Dungeons and Dragons meets like a Carry On kind of thing. It really plays on those kind of fantasy archetypes, and it's all about what happens after the prophecy has been fulfilled, and all of a sudden you have to rule a kingdom and you don't know what you're doing. So that's the next book for me, and then of course, like everybody else, just things in the works. But definitely more queer fantasy coming your way, a contemporary fantasy, and then other fantasy.
All the fantasy for us. Amy, what about you?
I'm in that horrible place where I'm just on submission and it's awful. It's like, I mean, obviously, as we all know, publishing which usually moves so quickly, is shockingly just extra slow right now. I'm on sub with a YA ghost story, and I'm going on sub this week with a middle grade fantasy, which I'm very excited about. And now I'm writing it's like a summertime suspense adult novel, just because I really needed to do something different. So I was like, oh yeah, let's just do it. I'm like such a true crime junkie. I was just like, I'm just gonna write something like crimey, like just fun.
We look forward to that when that comes out. Maggie, what about you?
I mentioned I have a graphic novel illustrated by Lisa Sturl coming out this fall from Green Willow. It's called Squad. It takes place in the town that I grew up in and went to high school. And I've been saying it's like the book of my secret ugly heart. So I'm like really excited for people to read it. And then I also have a picture book right now that's available for order, which is the only heterosexual thing I've ever written, because it's the true story of my grandparents who met in a Japanese incarceration camp during World War II. It's illustrated by Yazi Mamura, and I think it just went up for pre-order like last week, so that's very exciting. And this is not available for pre-order. I'm just fucking amped on it. I have another YA graphic novel called The Worst Ronin that's going to be illustrated by Faith Schaefer. That's about two lady samurai, one who's just like a complete dirtbag washout and one who's like a big try-hard, kind of in like an odd couple situation, fighting monsters and like killing dudes and farts. So I'm excited for that one.
That sounds really awesome. All of these sound great. All right, so we're about to wrap this up. So thank you so much, MK, Amy, FT, Maggie, and CB for this amazing discussion. Last question, where can readers find more information about you and your work? If each of you want to share that real quick.
I think everything for me is Amy Ewing Books, like Twitter, Instagram, my website, it's all Amy Ewing Books. That's the best place you can find.
Mine are sadly not all the same, so the easiest thing is probably just to go to mkengland.com and follow the links there, because there's m.k.england, mk_England, just go to the
links. You can find me on my website at it's prettyokmaggie.com. And then I'm on Twitter like way too much because I have a small son and sometimes I get bored. So my Twitter handle is at EMTEEHALL. So like MT Hall, but spelled out.
I am FT Lukens on Twitter and FT Lukens on Instagram, and that's the best places to find me. And I am on there all the time, even when I'm at my day job. I will look at them and check them throughout the day. So feel free to hit me up on any of those.
You can find me at my website at cb-lee.com, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram at cblee_cblee, because it's double the fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again. To wrap it up, I'm Kalisha Cole. Thank you for watching the Queer Adventure panel, and thank you for joining us at Pride Book Fest 2021.